What's up, investors? It's the Russian death. For more than 4 years, the Kremlin has tried to sell Russians very unusual idea, which is that the country can be involved in the largest confrontation of the Putin's era, while ordinary people continue living almost exactly as they did before, buying imported phones, traveling abroad, and treating everything happening beyond the television screen as just somebody else's responsibility. But Russia's growing fuel crisis, internet disruptions, and the visible consequences of drone strikes are now breaking that illusion. And the most revealing part is not even the crisis itself, but the way government propaganda has suddenly begun speaking about it. Instead of promising that everything is stable and everything is under control as they did pretty much forever, pro-government voices are now comparing the present situation with the 1990s and even with the Eastern Front during the Second World War, telling people that Russia survived difficult times before and will survive them again. Which sounds patriotic until you remember that Vladimir Putin's entire political mythology was built around the promise that Russians would never ever again have to endure the instability, shortages, and the humiliation associated with the 1990s. For decades, the arrangement was very simple. The government handled politics, ordinary people handled private life, and neither side asked too many questions about what the other side was doing. But now the very same officials who demanded silence are suddenly speaking about we and us, about unity, about the shared sacrifice, as though the public had selected these goals, approved the strategy, or even been told that what the final destination was supposed to be. That change in language may appear small at first, but it reveals that the old authoritarian deal between the Kremlin and Russian society is beginning to crack. Let's talk about all of this in today's video. But before we proceed, guys, if any of you ever wanted to do just a one-time support to our work, you can do so through PayPal donations. The link is down below. Thanks so much. Let's begin. Here's what most people overlook. During 2022 and 2023, Russian propaganda was not primarily asking citizens to become heroic symbols of sacrifice, or reorganize their lives around the war, or even celebrate workers producing military underwear 24 hours a day. Because the model citizen was still the consumer, who behaved as though February 24, 2022 had changed almost nothing. The ideal Russian was supposed to drink an iced lavender latte, follow it with Aperol spritz, visit a fashionable restaurant, travel around, and then just find a technical workaround that convinced the vehicle's software that they were actually in Moscow, not in, Hamburg. Because the real propaganda victory was not rejecting Western products, but proving that sanctions could be bypassed without seriously changing anyone else's lifestyle. A new iPhone appearing in Moscow before it could even be pre-ordered in Paris became proof that Russia remained connected to the global consumer world, while wealthy residents of Moscow, St. Petersburg, or any other multi-million city were encouraged to believe that Western restrictions were just an inconvenience rather than transformation of the entire country. This also explains the strange attacks on political exiles such as Andrei Makarevich and Boris Akunin, because propaganda accused them of serving the CIA or even the SBU. Yet the emotional center of the criticism was that they had rejected comfort, money, and access to the Russian market because of what officials presented as ridiculous moral concerns, while everyone who stayed was supposedly enjoying prosperity and struggling only with the pleasant question of how to spend it all. The broader public was not required to praise the war every single morning, because enthusiastic support remained a more specialized political performance. Instead, ordinary people were encouraged to retreat into work, shopping, entertainment, family, and just their own private ambitions, maintaining the fantasy that the invasion existed on television only, but not in their everyday lives. Even the 2022 mobilization campaign followed this logic, because rather than using patriotic hymns and a grand national appeal, officials often communicated something closer to "why would you even care?" while the removal of one person just from a family or workplace was compared to taking one gummy bear from a family-sized pack, as though the impact was just even too small to deserve attention. It may have been the quietest mobilization campaign in modern history in any country in the world, but it reflected an authoritarian strategy in which the Kremlin treated the war as it treated the Winter Olympics, elections, and geopolitical planning, which is that these or government projects with the real objectives belong to the small circle and explanations to common folk being completely unnecessary. I mean, why should the king explain himself to, I don't know, a peasant? Kiev had not been taken, but citizens were told not to focus on that. Russian forces left Kherson after officials called it a forever Russian city, but the contradiction was supposed to disappear. Anyone who wanted to participate could receive a multi-million ruble payment, while everyone else could keep buying imported electronics, vacationing in Thailand, and accessing Xbox games through an account registered in Turkey. Import substitution could exist in speeches, while the aircraft carrying tourists to Bali remained a Boeing, with engines and landing gear obtained from Kazakhstan or any other intermediary. And this illusion worked, because the Kremlin did not ask society to share responsibility, only to remain passive. But that passivity was not accidental, because it came from an unwritten agreement that had shaped Russia for roughly a quarter of a century. Let's dig a little bit deeper, because the relationship between the Russian state and its citizens was never based on shared responsibility or a serious belief that public institutions belong to the people, but on a quiet agreement that the government would ignore much of private life as long as citizens stayed away from politics, major business interests, and questions that threatened the people at the very top. The state behaved less like a normal government and more like a wealthy and dangerous neighbor in a residential complex, someone who could cause enormous trouble, but genuinely did not care at all pretty much how you earned cash, what rules you quietly ignored, or what lifestyle you displayed, as long as it was not extraordinary and provided that you did not inspect his property in return or challenge his authority. This is why classic Western stories about money laundering could seem almost backwards in Russia, because an officially unemployed person in the West would need to explain how they afforded a Ferrari, or even worse, a luxurious mansion, or any other signs of wealth in general, while in Russia, the more common instinct was to just withdraw money, avoid taxes, and purchase a brand new Mercedes or a 5-bedroom apartment with bags of cash, while expecting the authorities to look away. And in most cases, well, they did. In return, society was expected to ignore the elite's villas, unexplained fortunes, and enormous residences, which became especially visible during the investigative journalism boom of the 2010s, when Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation released drone footage of officials' estates, including properties covering roughly 400 acres and private buildings resembling the Palace of Versailles. The government rarely offered a serious moral defense since then, because its deeper response was that ordinary citizens had no right to ask about somebody else's money, when many of them were also working informally, underreporting income, or submitting tax returns that could barely be distinguished from a Tinder profile. Random, but yeah. The implied bargain was simple and deeply unequal. The state ignored your unofficial earnings, while you ignored the fortunes of the ruling class. And this allowed the Kremlin to function without persuasion, representation, or meaningful accountability. The same model shaped elections, because officials decided who would be allowed to participate and what result would eventually be announced, while citizens could cast a ballot if they enjoyed the so-called ritual, provided they obviously understood that their vote would not determine the outcome in any way. The war initially fit the same pattern, even almost like the dangerous neighbor leaving the building to start a confrontation several blocks away, while everyone else insisted that they did not know the people involved and had never been asked to approve his directions and actions. That distance remained politically useful while salaries rose, foreign vacations continued, imported products stayed available, and the consequences were concentrated among other specific families, mobilized communities, and border regions. But the arrangement was never designed for a moment when the war would enter gas stations, workplaces, internet connections, and the streets outside people's homes. And once that happened, the Kremlin discovered that a society trained not to participate could not suddenly be transformed to a united national team by repeating the same word, we, over and over again. Now here's where things get tricky, because fuel shortages are not abstract statistics hidden inside an economic report, but something people see at gas stations and feel through transportational costs as a result, through agricultural expenses and, well, pretty much almost every other product that must move from one place to another. Which means a fuel crisis can and most likely will trigger a chain reaction from slower economic activity to wider inflation. At the same time, Russians are experiencing mobile internet shutdowns, watching drones reach areas closer to their own homes, hearing employers discussing layoffs, and discovering that familiar services no longer work reliably, if at all, while the state can no longer promise that professionals will handle everything without demanding anything else from ordinary society. This is when propaganda changes its vocabulary completely, and Margarita Simonyan suddenly started saying that we survived the 1990s, that we once lived with food stamps, that we have already been through everything, and that we will make it through the present difficulties as well. Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin uses the same language when discussing gas stations, arguing that Russia will handle these problems just as it handled earlier challenges, that adversaries tried to crush the financial system and reduce the economy to its ruins, but all of them they just failed. And that citizens must consolidate rather than just being vibrating, quote-unquote, panicking or helping the other side. Then we have Valentina Matvienko, chairwoman of the Federation Council, who also moved into this same collective language, even though she once spoke as if all money in Russia ultimately belonged to the ruler itself. And now she assures that the public that we will find a way out, that everyone knows who is responsible, and that people should stop dramatizing, avoid fear, and just join forces. The sudden appearance of these pronouns is the real story, because we suggest shared ownership, shared decisions, and a shared understanding of the goal. Yet none of those things existed when the government began the war, whenever they criminalized opposition and repeatedly changed its explanations of what success was actually supposed to mean in the first place. Citizens heard about NATO, security, biolabs, history, and Ukraine's political direction, while Russian forces first moved towards Kiev, later abandoned that objective, declared Kherson permanently Russian, then left it, and periodically suggested that a new relationship with Donald Trump obviously, might solve the situation before returning to vague language about the goals of the so-called special military operation. Nobody clearly explained those goals, and questioning them could bring an 8-year prison sentence, and for many people, unfortunately, it did, which created a straightforward public understanding. This was not our strategy or our responsibility, because the government had spent years insisting that ordinary people had no right to define any part of it. And now, officials are asking the very same public to accept higher prices, economic uncertainty, and personal risk in the name of an outcome that remains unclear, which feels less like unity and more like an attempt to distribute responsibility after the consequences have become impossible to hide. And whether that strategy succeeds depends on a fundamental difference between democracy, totalitarianism, and autocracy. Because for any clear-minded person, this "we" sounds empty and completely blameful. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because democratic, totalitarian, authoritarian governments can all ask people to endure hardship. Yet the request means something completely different depending on whether citizens chose the leadership, participated in the decision, or were at least offered a coherent ideological future in exchange for present sacrifice. A democratic government can tell citizens that the country has been attacked, or in rare cases that it has chosen to begin a conflict because they had no other choice, and then argues that voters selected this leadership over its opponents in the past, gave it a mandate, and will eventually have an opportunity to remove it if needed if the decision proves disastrous. People may reject that argument and vote the government out, but the system still contains a mechanism of consent and accountability, which is why an elected leader can invoke the spirit of Winston Churchill and ask society to accept the price, tears, economic pressure, and personal sacrifice, while claiming to represent the public will. A totalitarian system, on the other hand, operates completely differently. But it also still tries to mobilize society around a huge ideological promise, whether that means building global communism, expanding living space, establishing national greatness, or constructing a future so glorious that present poverty, shortages, and poor clothing are just described as temporary inconveniences and temporary steps towards a historic destination. The promise may be dishonest or destructive, but it still places citizens inside a common project, telling them that today's suffering will create a world of equality, ideological triumph, or national dominance for their children. Putin's autocracy has neither democratic legitimacy nor a totalitarian vision, because it spent decades weakening institutions, discouraging participation, and replacing ideology with private consumption, which means that the new message does not sound like we chose this path together or that we are building a new world together. Instead, it sounds like that we made the decisions alone, refused to explain them to you, silenced criticism, failed to achieve the promised results, and now we need you to absorb the consequences. That is exactly why constant appeals for unity may expose weakness rather than create strength, because a confident authoritarian state tells citizens that everything is controlled and that they can continue their private lives, while a worried one begs them not to panic, not to complain, not to vibrate, like they said, not to notice that the government is demanding loyalty without offering clarity or a representation. The more officials insist that everyone is in the same boat, the more people may notice that the cabins were never even equal, the route was never discussed, and those who selected the destination remain protected from the worst consequences. Russia is not the same thing as the Kremlin. Ordinary Russians are not identical to the officials making these decisions, and people can care deeply about their homeland without accepting that every failure of one ruler must automatically become a sacred national burden. And that distinction becomes especially important when the government reaches for the most powerful warning in Putin's political history. The 1990s, the time of horrors that Putin personally promised Russia will never ever experience ever again. And just like many others, this promise was broken. Here's where it all starts to make sense. For more than 2 decades, Putin's strongest political argument was not that Russia had become perfectly democratic, economically fair, or institutionally honest, but that his rule had rescued the country from the chaos of the 1990s and guaranteed that ordinary people would never again face the same instability, collapsing systems, unpredictable prices, and national humiliation. Whenever Russians complained about corruption, censorship, or the absence of genuine political competition, officials could reply that stability mattered more, that the alternative was disorder, and that every flaw under Putin was still preferable to returning to the decade everyone had been taught to fear. This is once again why Margarita Simonyan's claim that Russia survived the 1990s and can survive the current period as well is so revealing, because it quietly abandons the promise that justified the political system and replaces it with a weaker message, which is that the government can no longer protect people from hardship, but citizens should be grateful that similar hardship did not destroy them before. The comparison with the Eastern Front during the Second World War creates an even greater contradiction, because it borrows emotional power from one of Russia's most important historical memories, yet officials still cannot explain why fuel shortages, internet shutdowns, inflation, and layoffs should be treated as the unavoidable cost of defending society from an immediate threat. Instead, people remember that the government selected this course, concealed its assumptions, underestimated the consequences, and then punished those who warned that the strategy could fail long before. Which means that every demand for endurance risks sounding like an attempt to make society responsible for the mistakes of those who never shared power. Authoritarian rule is comfortable when decisions appear successful, because one leader can claim credit for higher income, stability, and victory, but concentrated authority becomes a trap when the same decisions create visible failure, since responsibility cannot be easily transferred to parliament, independent institutions, or voters who supposedly demanded the policy. The Kremlin, once again, can blame NATO, Ukraine, sanctions, Western governments, internal critics, or disloyal businesses, yet the basic structure still remains way too obvious. The leadership that claimed exclusive authority over every other major choice now wants collective ownership of the consequences. This does not mean that the system collapses tomorrow, because authoritarian governments unfortunately can survive long periods of stagnation, fear, and political withdrawal, while many people respond to pressure by retreating further into private life rather than confronting the state. But the old formula of leave politics to us and we will protect your normal life becomes impossible to defend when politics repeatedly interrupts fuel, employment, public safety, and the prediction of the next month. The state may still enforce obedience, but it cannot recreate the trust it never built, and it cannot turn decades of passivity into genuine solidarity simply by repeating the word "we" on television. Guys, if you found this breakdown useful, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, because today's story is not only about fuel or propaganda, but about what happens when an authoritarian government's promises collide with every single day reality. Don't forget about Patreon, PayPal, merch, all these links are down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Wednesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.